Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Bash at the Beach 1998. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is a Raven's Rules match. It is Raven versus Saturn. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Raven and Saturn, with Raven keeping the pace of the match. Kanyon makes his way out to the ring. Kanyon ends up hitting a flatliner on Raven, but Raven ends up hitting a DDT on Saturn, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Raven. Hats off to Raven for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Juventud Guerrera versus Billy Kidman. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrera and Kidman, with Guerrera keeping the pace of the match. Guerrera hits a head scissors on Kidman. Guerrera then hits a springboard Frankensteiner on Kidman as well. And Guerrera ultimately hits his signature 450 splash off the top rope on Kidman. Pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Juventud Guerrera. Hats off to Juventud Guerrera for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Chavo Guerrero versus Stevie Ray. I thought this was an awful match. Ray ends up keeping the pace of the match, with Stevie Ray winning the match by submission on Chavo Guerrero. Hats off to Stevie Ray for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a hair versus hair match. It is Eddie Guerrero versus Chavo Guerrero. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Eddie and Chavo, with Eddie keeping the pace of the match. Eddie Guerrero ultimately hits a roll-up on Chavo Guerrero, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Eddie Guerrero. Hats off to Eddie Guerrero for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Konnan versus Disco Inferno. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Konnan and Inferno, with Konnan keeping the pace of the match. Kevin Nash gets involved in the match by hitting a jackknife powerbomb on Disco Inferno, which allows Konnan to apply his signature Tequila Sunrise on Disco Inferno, and your winner of the match is Konnan. Hats off to Konnan for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Kevin Green versus the Giant. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Green and the Giant, with the Giant keeping the pace of the match. And the Giant ultimately hits a chokeslam on Kevin Green, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is the Giant. Hats off to the Giant for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Mysterio and Jericho, with Jericho keeping the pace of the match. Dean Malenko makes his way out to the ring. Ray capitalizes on this by hitting a roll-up on Jericho. Pins for the 3. And your winner of the match, and at that time new Cruiserweight Champion, is Rey Mysterio Jr. Hats off to Rey Mysterio Jr. for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Television Championship. It is Bret Hart versus Booker T. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Hart and Booker T, with Hart keeping the pace of the match. Booker T ends up hitting a scissor kick on Hart. Booker T then hits a missile drop kick off the top rope on Hart as well. But Hart hits Booker T with a chair shot, which allows Booker T to get the win by disqualification. Hats off to Booker T for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. It is Goldberg versus Curt Hennig. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Goldberg and Hennig, with Goldberg keeping the pace of the match. Hennig then hits a fisherman suplex on Goldberg for a near fall, but Goldberg gets up, hits a spear on Hennig as well as a jackhammer, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Goldberg. Hats off to Goldberg for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Bash at the Beach 1998. It is Diamond Dallas Page teaming up with Karl Malone versus Hollywood Hogan and Dennis Rodman. I thought this was a good matchup. back and forth matchup between DDP, Malone, and Hogan and Rodman, with DDP and Malone keeping the pace of the match. Hogan then lands a big boot on DDP, but DDP gets up, hits a diamond cutter on Hogan. Malone then hits a diamond cutter of his own on Rodman. The Disciple is in the ring, ends up hitting a stunner on Diamond Dallas Page. Hogan then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Hollywood Hogan and Dennis Rodman. Couple things I'm going to say about WCW's Bash at the Beach 1998 before I get out of here, man. Number one, this was a solid event from top to bottom. There was a couple matches on this card that were halfway decent. Raven versus Saturn in a Ravens Rules match was a solid matchup. Chavo Guerrero versus Stevie Ray I thought was an awful match. I don't know why that was booked. Eddie Guerrero versus Chavo in a hair versus hair match was a solid matchup. Kevin Green versus the Giant, again, solid matchup. Mysterio versus Jericho for the Cruiserweight Championship. I've mentioned this multiple times in the past, man. The Cruiserweights were severely underrated, and they've always made for a great match. Booker T and Bret Hart, again, solid matchup. But it all came down to the main event. It was DDP teaming up with Karl Malone versus Hollywood Hogan and Dennis Rodman. A couple things I'm going to say about this matchup alone, man, is number one, WCW and what WCW did for the fans. I think WCW was really good at bringing in other celebrities, other athletes into professional wrestling. And what I mean by that is that a lot of, prime example, Steve Mongo McMichael. Obviously came back from a football background. Played defense for the Chicago Bears. He came into the fold with WCW, became a part of the Four Horsemen. And having having the teachings, if you will, of the likes of Arn Anderson and Ric Flair only helped McMichael in his in-ring career. And what I mean by that is like you have so many celebrities and different sports athletes. Like they brought in Reggie White for a match one time I believe it was against Steve McMichael. And it was a decent match. They brought in Kevin Green for a couple matches, and Kevin Green really held his own, and it had a lot of good matches. This is another prime example of that. Karl Malone and obviously Dennis Rodman come from an NBA background, 2 Hall of Famers, and it just made for a great match, and it always got the fans invested. I mean, when they had Malone coming in and Dennis Rodman, they got a lot of eyeballs on the product from other different sports outlets like ESPN and stuff like that were talking about the fact that, Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone were going to be wrestling at a pay-per-view for WCW. So obviously it brings, eyeballs to the product when it pertains to WCW. So I think WCW needs a pat on the back for that, because I think they were always really good in bringing in other athletes to the company and allowing them to wrestle and put on fantastic matches and great memories for the fans. I think even WCW brought in Jay Leno, and Leno teamed up with DDP against Hogan and Bischoff. I think it was at Road Wild 1998. And it made for a great match, man. A lot of people were invested in these matches, and it made for great memories and made for great history in professional wrestling, man, because, before this, you really weren't getting that kind of stuff in the early days of professional wrestling. You just weren't. A lot of other athletes from different, companies and, different sports backgrounds were not coming into professional wrestling to have matches, and WCW was putting that together, man. So it made for a great card. It made for a really good, interesting main event, and Hogan ended up becoming victorious with the helps from the Disciple, by the Disciple hitting the cutter on Diamond Dallas Page. So it just made for a great match and a great main event. But with that being said, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. 1 being the worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give Bash at the Beach 1998 a solid rating of a 5.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW's Bash at the Beach 1998. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.